With the start of the Bronze Age on Crete around 5,000 years ago, one could assume that there would be a marked shift defining a new era. The steps from stone to bronze should have been a noticeable one. But in reality, the early Bronze Age on Crete looks and functions much like it did at the end of the Neolithic. Previously, most scholars regarded the start of the Bronze Age on Crete as a form of emergence, from a state of isolation during the Neolithic to a period of trade, technology, and administration during the Bronze Age. Yet it has become clear that Crete was less isolated during the Neolithic than previously thought, and much more connected to trade and cultures around the wider Aegean. Many of these social, economic, and political developments, which historically have been regarded as defining features of the Bronze Age, had emerged far earlier than previously thought. Many sites, which have come to define the early Bronze Age, had in fact been settled since the Neolithic, showing that the transition between the Bronze Age and Neolithic was noticeably less sudden than originally assumed. The increased occupation of marginal areas, areas with a low population in the periphery of already settled areas, seemed to have started during the final Neolithic and saw a continuation into the Bronze Age. Small settlements consisting of a couple of households, usually around 50 individuals, partaking in a more specialized economy, engaging in both mixed farming but also more specialized production of sought-after prestige items and goods, came to define the Cretan landscape, applying different survival strategies, often defined by the limitation of the local landscape. As settlements became better at exploiting local resources, utilizing new tools and techniques, along with incorporating new food sources, the local population started to grow, increasing the size of the settlements. Farmers were producing cheese and yogurt by boiling milk from their large herds, which allowed for more nutrient-dense food sources along with easier storage, allowing for a larger buffer during hard times. Better storage of dairy products also enabled farmers to maintain larger herds of goats, sheep, and cattle, as excess dairy products now could be utilized for later use. Many of these changes had already started during the late Neolithic. It is no wonder that the early Bronze Age is a period defined by increased population on the island. Yet there is another noticeable factor, which also contributed to the population increase on the island, namely migration at the beginning of the Bronze Age. Immigrants from mainly the Cyclades, but also possibly from Anatolia and mainland Greece, came to settle along the northern shores of the island, especially around the eastern parts. The migrants brought with them their own cultural traditions, ceramic styles, and burial practices. These migrant coastal communities also maintained good connection with the home region, which resulted in an influx in trade and import of foreign goods to and from the island. The archaeological evidence from the early Minoan I period is far less plentiful than later periods, mostly due to the fact that most archaeological finds are from graves which to a great extent have been looted or disturbed in other ways. Some communal graves were also in use for multiple centuries, containing a mixture of items from different time periods. At the same time, the population of the early Minoan I period is far smaller than that of later periods. Yet the period is defined by large geographic cultural variation. Crete truly displayed a mosaic of cultures with unique practices and connections. The settlements on the Messara Plain and the Etruscan Mountains started to construct their own communal tombs, so-called Tholos tombs, circular beehive tombs with incrementally smaller diameter for every vertical increase, creating a dome-like structure, a core-built vault, sometimes compared to a beehive. At the small settlement of Tripiti on the south side of the Etruscan Mountains, we can find an early example of a Tholos tomb from the early Minoan I period. During the early Minoan II period, more Tholos tombs would be constructed, and the nearby hill would be settled, creating a small acropolis overlooking the sea and the tombs. The new settlement was positioned in a perfectly defensible position, which might indicate the potential dangers connected to being located so close to the sea. Looking at a top-down view of the settlement, there exists a clear pathway running from the west to the east, separating the north and south halves of the settlement. In the northern sector, 3 different houses can be discerned, each with their own separate storage area as well as cupboard and a hearth. The southern sector might have been home to around 4 or 5 households, but it is difficult to know the exact layout of the southern sector due to various construction phases and of course destruction over time. We could imagine that around 30 to 50 individuals would have made Tripiti their home, and considering the dry and rugged surrounding landscape, a larger population may not even have been possible. The construction of most Tholos tombs started sometime during the early Minoan II period, around 2700 BC. The Tholos tombs which exist from the early Minoan I period are generally smaller in diameter than the later tombs, and they also lack annexes, additional rooms, a key feature in later tombs but non-existent at early Minoan I tombs. At Tholos Tomb A at Eileithyia, to the west of Tripiti, a large number of early Minoan I pottery have been found undisturbed, indicated that the tomb was in use already during this early period. An adjacent tomb, Tomb B at Eileithyia, is far larger and in much better condition, also containing an adjoining annex with small rooms. It is most probable that this tomb was constructed during the early Minoan II period, but it is not impossible that this tomb could have been constructed during the early Minoan I period at the same time as Tomb A. Yet just like most Tholos tombs, the tombs at Eileithyia have been subject to heavy looting, a noticeable problem which both disturbs the order of the layer and leaves the site without ceramics for dating. As the lowest stratum has been looted in the distant past and no undisturbed deposits of pottery have been found, it is basically impossible to know whether any early Minoan I pottery found on the site was actually deposited during the early Minoan I period or just much later. At certain Tholos tombs, even Neolithic grave goods have been found in the early Minoan stratum, indicating that ceremonial goods deposited at tombs could be multiple centuries old, making the dating of these tombs even more difficult, as the date of the construction isn't necessarily representative of the items deposited. Around the tomb we also find various courtyards, which probably function as a ceremonial area for the mourners to gather around and engage in communal feasting, which also might explain why archaeologists have found remains from more than 100 vessels strewn around the surrounding courtyard at Eileithyia. Towards the most eastern edge of the internal courtyard is a small stone wall which separates the outer and the inner courtyard. And attached to the wall is a small but significant rectangular structure, which probably functioned as an altar used during burials. During the early Minoan II period, the Tomb B wall at Eileithyia was expanded with the construction of a second outer wall. A second wall is a common feature among most later Tholos tombs, although it is difficult to know whether the outer wall served for a structural purpose, just considering the frequency of earthquakes in the region, or if it was just used for an aesthetic purpose, making the tomb look larger and therefore more impressive. While it may be hard to discern the existence of a second outer wall when studying Tomb B at Eileithyia from a ground level, looking at another nearby Tholos tomb at Apesokari from a bird's eye view, we can more clearly see the distinct separation between an initial inner and a later outside wall. Another feature of the early Minoan II period is the construction of the adjoining rectangular building, a type of annex which seems to have functioned as an auxiliary building to the tomb itself. As any visitor to the tomb needed to go through the auxiliary building, it is not impossible that it might have functioned as a ceremonial room for rituals and worship. The close architectural resemblance of the auxiliary rectangular building to so-called Cretan house tombs indicates that the building may also have been used for burials in the same fashion as the central chamber. Burials in Tholos tombs seem to have been communal, the idea that each inhabitant within the settlement had access to being buried in at least one of the tombs connected to the settlement. Given the frequency of Tholos tombs in relation to the number of inhabitants for each settlement, the act of being buried in a tomb would not have been a form of luxury, reserved only for specific individuals, but a sort of common rite, essential for the sort of ancestral worship which seemed to underline early Minoan religion. Yet, there might still have been a certain degree of discrimination regarding which tomb an individual would have been buried inside. When comparing the physical features of the individuals buried in Tomb A with those buried in Tomb B at Eileithyia, notable differences in age could be discerned between the dead. Tomb A seemed to have been open to individuals of all ages, while the skeletal remains from Tomb B all belong to older individuals, some surpassing 50 years of age. That being said, the use of Tomb A and Tomb B are not contemporary, with Tomb B starting to be used around the time when burials at Tomb A had ceased. As a result, the bones indicate the burials of two different groups who represent the different periods in Minoan history, and we shouldn't draw too many conclusions from this information. Most theories imagine that burials in specific tombs were dependent on ancestry and household affiliation, not social class. Although there are some examples of Tholos tombs constructed after the pre-palatial period, such as the Tholos tomb at Camilari, built during the Middle Minoan 1B period, the same time as the first Great Palace at Phaistos was built, the Tholos tomb should still be considered mainly a pre-palatial phenomena, even though the use of some of these tombs continue well into the late Minoan period. On the opposite side of the Etruscan mountains from the settlement at Tripti, there existed numerous settlements, which also erected Tholos tombs in a similar fashion. At Koumasa, 3 Tholos tombs were constructed in total, along with a small square tomb. Now these tombs are located downhill from the nearby settlement, which sort of peers out over the structures, making the tomb a feature of the landscape, easily viewed from the settlement, just like those at Tripiti. The 2 Tholos tombs A and B were both built along with the rectangular tomb during the early Minoan II period, around 2700 BC. The remaining tomb, Tomb E, might have been contemporary with the other tombs, but it seems to possibly also have been a later construction. The tombs all have a form of antechamber at the entrance, which probably had a ceremonial function during the burial and the later periods of mourning, potentially a place used for offerings or the pouring of libations. The bones found at Tholos Tomb B span a period of centuries, indicating that the tomb was in use for long periods by the same community. Interestingly enough, even after a specific tomb had ceased to be used for burials, inhabitants seem to have returned to the tomb to worship and perform rituals, a form of ancestral worship which we see throughout most of early Bronze Age Crete. In the mind of the local population, the Tholos tomb were a form of feature of the landscape, a type of house of the dead, which represented both a connection to the distant past and the inhabitants' ancestral history. Maintaining these tombs would thus have been quite important for the community, which is also probably why we see such long-term use and maintenance of these tombs. Although some Tholos tombs were in use for more than a millennia, the form or shape of the tomb never really changed, only really becoming larger and more impressive in some cases. The true change came in the form of new burial practices and the construction of new annexes, such as the rectangular building at Eileithyia, which we discussed earlier. At Tholos Tomb B at Apesukari, a few kilometers west of Koumasa, the tomb itself was in use from the early Minoan II period until the end of the Middle Minoan period, nearly 1,000 years. Like the tomb at Eileithyia, the Tholos tomb at Apesukari was constructed using a 2-layer wall. The annex connected to the entrance of the tomb is a later construction, which also functioned as an area designated for burials. The long adjoining room, the so-called Room 2, saw a use of new burial vessels, so-called lanakes. Lanakes were basically a form of oblong clay or wood coffin where the remains of the deceased was stored. It is towards the end of the early Minoan II period, around 2200 BC, that the first lanakes were found in Cretan cemeteries. although it is not impossible that the tradition started much earlier, even perhaps as early as the early Minoan 1 period. But due to the potential use of wood, these lanakes no longer remains. These clay vessels were generally quite small, and commonly without decoration, or just with simple linear decoration. This example was used for the burial of a child, but looking at later lanakes, we see the typical oblong form with rich decoration. During burials, the body was placed in the lanak, in the fetal position, and a lid was placed atop. The lanak was then put inside one of the adjoining rooms to rest. The large number of clay fragments from broken lanakes might indicate that once sufficient time had passed, the lanak was destroyed and the remains deposited in a nearby ossuary. Just like most Tholos tombs, the tombs at Agia and Koumasa has experienced heavy looting. It is really only the tomb at Hierokambos, located not far from Tripiti, which has been partially spared from the widespread looting. After having been used for burials during the early Minoan 1 period, the corbelled roof of the tomb at Hierokambos collapsed, burying the early Minoan 1 grave goods with the rubble. Instead of removing the fallen stone blocks, the locals rebuilt the tomb and continued to use it for burials. The stone blocks seem to have created a protective barrier, saving parts of the tomb from looting. The tomb at Hierokambos have thus helped us get a greater insight into the burial practices and deposited grave goods of Tholos tombs, especially during the early Minoan 1 period. So how was the Tholos tomb used, and what can be said of its function during early Minoan society on Crete? Using the tomb at Apesokari as an example. So the body of the deceased would be brought to the outside of the tomb where the mourners would be gathered. The body itself would later be brought into the tomb by 1 or 2 attendants through the small entrance while the mourners remained outside. Personal effects such as rings, weaponry or pottery would be placed next to the body as a symbolic connection to the life of the deceased. An indication that the items would have had some sort of connection to the deceased is the large number of pyxes found within the tombs. So pyxes are generally a small cylindrical vessel with a lid and usually without handles, commonly serving as a sort of personal storage vessel for trinkets, jewelry or cosmetics during a person's life. Although the design of the pyxe became more standardized as we moved towards the late pre-palatial period, the pyxes of the early pre-palatial period allow for a large degree of artistical freedom, resulting in some rather bizarre ceramic vessels, such as this pyxe with horns found at Tomb 2 at Hierokambos, dating to the early Minoan 1 period. Unlike later pyxes, this example sports small handles which would allow for the lid to be tied to the body or hold the ceramic suspended. The horn pyxe is also an example of so-called Lebanaware, a form of ceramic style given its name from the nearby Hellenistic port city of Lebana. The red or light brownish burnish background with the white linear decoration are the defining characteristics of the so-called Lebanaware, a regional ceramic style found around the Etruscan mountains and the Mesera plain, a common type of Tholos tomb grave goods found during the early Minoan 1 period. Another ceramic style from the south-central region of Crete are the so-called Agios Onouphros ware, given its name by the small cemetery just outside of Phaistos where these wares were first discovered. We commonly find the ceramic style on high spouted jugs, decorated with parallel lines which on occasion would cross, giving the ware an elegant geometric finish which would be unique for each vessel. The production of these wares started with the early Bronze Age and were fashioned in a style which could be described as inverted Lebanaware, with a reddish decoration on a light creamy white background. As both pottery styles were produced around the Mesera plain during the same time period, it is quite probable that workshops would produce both styles. The Agios Onouphros style was certainly the more popular of the two styles during the early Minoan 1 period, with pottery being distributed and traded around central Crete, with examples found by Knossos and by the Eileithyia cave just east of Knossos. Lebanaware, on the other hand, was more restricted to the areas around the Etruscan mountains and Mesera plains. By the early Minoan 2, we will start to see the further development of the Agios Onouphros style, with the emergence of so-called Koumasa ware from the settlement at Koumasa, a style which continues the tradition of red or dark linear decoration on a white light background, in this case with the decoration only partially covering the surface of the pottery. The Koumasa style is a defining feature of the start of the early Minoan II period, a key marker of a new period around central Crete, often denominated as the early Minoan IIa period, lasting some time between 2700 BC to 2450 BC. Another form of grave goods which commonly was placed within the tomb next to the body were small clay bowls or stone pits grouped together to form a large ceremonial ware. These wares, so-called kernos, are assumed to have been used for offerings, where each receptacle of the kernos was filled with various offerings of value, such as honey, wheat, barley, oils, flowers, fruit, or even milk. Both clay and stone kernoi have been found throughout Crete, although the stone-type kernoi certainly was more common around the vaulted tombs at south-central Crete. There is also various examples of stone slab kernoi, where the depression were etched into larger stone slabs or into the architecture itself, but they serve the same purpose as the smaller clay or stone kernoi, being a receptacle for offerings. Now these examples are later kernoi from the central court at the palace at Malia, but the tradition of using kernoi for offerings seemed to have been a religious practice maintained throughout the Bronze Age on Crete. As the deceased had been placed within the tomb, relatives and mourners would stay outside, pouring libations, sharing foods and drinks. This period of mourning would probably last for a very long time, when mourners would frequently return to the tomb to contemplate the life of the deceased. The pouring of libations would have had a noticeable religious or cult-like function undertaken well after the burial itself, connecting the mourner with their ancestors and appeasing the gods. These pouring vessels, often of clay, used for the pouring of libations would often be of a zoomorphic nature, taking the shape of either domestic or wild animals. A key type of pouring vessel, which will be found around most Minoan religious areas throughout the Bronze Age, is a so-called rhyton, derived from the Greek word to flow, rheo. Consider for example rheology, the study of the flow of matter, mainly liquid and gases, as rhython and rheology share the same etymological origin. A rhython is basically a conical container or vessel for liquids, which unlike a cup could generally not be sat on a table and would instead be held upright by hand. Now some, but not all, rhythons had a small hole, either at the bottom or on the side of the container, which would allow for the liquid to flow through the vessel, which gives the vessel its name. These vessels with a spout or a second hole would usually deviate from the conical form, instead taking on either human or animal features due to their often religious function. Between the Tholos tombs at Koumasa, various rhythons have been found, most notably this rhython depicting what looks like a form of bull wrestling activity, with three males clinging to the horns of the beast. It is not impossible that the wrestling and eventual subjugation of a great bull was an important ceremonial activity during burials. Looking at the depiction of the presumably men hanging on the bull, they are not engaged in a form of acrobatic display like forms of bull leaping or bull wrestling later displayed in Minoan frescoes. Instead, they seem to actively try to bring the animal down. The subjugation of the bull might have been the first stage in a ceremonial sacrifice of the animal. Some have imagined that the rhython later was filled with the blood of the sacrificed bull, using the blood of the bull as a means of channeling the properties of the beast as it flowed through the muscle of the terracotta bull. The rhython could have served multiple functions, used to pour wine or milk into cups for communal drinking, pouring libations for the gods, or potentially pouring liquids such as different oils onto the body of the deceased. The existence of various rhythons taking different shapes might indicate that each vessel represented an aspect connected to the specific animal the rhython was shaped after. A bird rhython might have alluded to favourable omens, the bull connected to virility and strength, while anthropomorphic vessels such as this rhython from the end of the early Minoan in the shape of a female with two openings placed at the location of the breasts would have been regarded as a form of goddess connected to fertility. As the liquid was poured into the back of the figure, it would come gushing out from the breasts, representing fertility and possibly health. But the rhython, of course, wasn't the only form of pouring vessel, which might have had some sort of ceremonial function. Like, for example, double-bodied jugs, such as this item from the Messera plain, would have made a form of clucking sound as it poured from one body to the next. As the funeral would eventually come to a close, and as the mourning period eventually ended, the body of the deceased would start to slowly decompose, and eventually, the bones were collected and put in a small ossuary by the tomb, a small rectangular building or dugout area located just adjacent to the tomb and used for the housing of the bones of the deceased once the grieving period was over. The tombs around the Messera plain gives us the best insight into the material culture of the early Minoan period, and as an extent, the function of society, trade and production. As mentioned previously, metals such as silver, copper, gold or tin, as well as some other minerals, for example obsidian, are naturally absent from Crete. But among the grave goods around the Messera Valley, items of these exotic materials are very common, which indicates both the extent of trade during the period, but also the social values of these items. The existence of bronze items, for example, indicates a trade connection to areas where it could either produce copper, tin or arsenic. Sources of copper are more common and can be found within the Aegean, probably originating from the Cycladic island of Kitnos or the nearby island of Cyprus. As bronze is an alloy consisting of around 10 to 15% tin and the remainder copper, tin would have been an essential trading material, probably originating from small sources around the eastern Mediterranean, as well as large, more distant deposits around the Iberian Peninsula and as far west as Cornwall on the British Isles. From the east, most tin is assumed to have originated from deposits around the Hindu Kush mountain range in modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. It is not impossible that even the tin-rich deposits around Southeast Asia could have made their way to Crete, although this would have been during the later stage of the Bronze Age. There is, however, a problem with bronze during the early Bronze Age, especially the early Minoan 1 and 2, as tin was very rare. Yet, to make copper malleable, workable and more durable, you need to convert the copper into a form of alloy. So around the Aegean, arsenic was combined with copper to create a form of arsenic bronze, which, although not as durable as tin-based bronze, was far superior to any copper product. Exposure to arsenic, however, is a true health hazard, both during smelting and long-term use. So during the early pre-palatial, arsenic bronze remained the most common type of bronze, but by the late pre-palatial, superior tin-based bronze had become the standard. Daggers in a triangular shape are regular finds among the vaulted tombs, commonly in copper, as well as some in bronze and a few rare examples of silver daggers, like these two silver daggers found at the vaulted tomb at Koumasa. Although silver could be found at deposits in the Cyclades, and most famously at the mines of Laurion on Attica's eastern coast on mainland Greece, any individual able to be buried with such an item must have commanded a great deal of political and social power. A much more common type of grave goods, however, are obsidian tools and shards, which have been found deposited in Tholos tombs, sometimes numbering more than 100 obsidian items found in a single tomb. Jewellery, a standard indication and display of wealth and social standing, are certainly common, yet looting had made a negative impact on the number of items available. Some golden pendants and beads from necklaces are quite eye-catching, especially considering the fine craftsmanship of some of these items, such as this frog pendant, which would have been part of a necklace due to the existence of a small hole which runs lengthwise through the pendant. The pendant was found at Koumasa in Tholos Tomb B in southern Crete, and each golden orb would have been crafted individually, before being attached to the frog. A true indication of the development in metal craftsmanship which had arisen during the middle of the early Minoan period. Golden diadems, which are often closely connected to burials around northeastern Crete, especially the small island of Mochlos, can also be found in some Tholos tombs around the Messera plain. Consisting of a thin sheet of gold, the diadems are usually decorated with a geometrical pattern or simple imagery using a metalworking technique referred to as repoussage, where the patterns are hammered into the metal, creating small indentations resulting in an elevated relief decoration. In this famous example from Mochlos, the repoussage relief on the golden diadems are shaped like eyes, which might indicate that the diadems were in fact a form of death mask, covering the eyes of the deceased during the burial. Although it is not impossible that these diadems were created with various other purposes as well. The last form of personal items which should be discussed are the large number of seals found deposited in Tholos tombs. Each seal, when pressed against a lump of clay, would leave a specific pattern, basically a personal identifier or a form of signature which became an essential part in the administrative system of Minoan Crete during the later palace periods. These early seals were commonly created using soft stones, animal bones or tusks, and during the early Minoan II period, hippopotamus ivory, probably imported from Egypt or the Levant, became a popular material for seal creation. The early carvings or glyptic art found on Minoan seals are generally geometric in shape, although there are many seals which play on natural or wildlife motifs, such as this seal from Odigitria, which probably depicts a krikri, or commonly called agrimi, the domesticated Cretan goat, which is a recurring motif within Minoan depictions of the surrounding wildlife. The agrimi is depicted in various ways and are commonly found in a funerary context, such as at Tholos tombs, and is one of the more common motifs for deposited clay figurines which have been found inside tombs. This has led to a lot of speculation regarding the religious function of the agrimi. Some envisage the agrimi as an early Cretan deity which played a protectorate function or a specific role in the afterlife like the deities found in the Egyptian pantheon. Around the middle of the early Minoan period, there is a noticeable increase in foreign influence on deposited grave goods in vaulted tombs. A shift which relates to a general increase in trade around the wider Mediterranean. As new exotic wares entered Crete, new workshops would start to mimic these foreign items, creating copies with similar motifs. Egyptian seals were commonly made of steatite, a type of white, bright soapstone, and these seals became a very popular item for the Cretan workshops to mimic and reproduce. These reproduced items, often called white pieces, took the form of Egyptian motifs in glyptic, such as scarabs, bees, frogs, and apes, often made using local steatite or ivory to mimic the Egyptian versions. These motifs had religious significance within Egypt, connected to the local pantheon of gods, and as Egyptian items made their way throughout the Mediterranean, so did the religious iconography. The sudden introduction of imported Egyptian scarabs as funerary gifts certainly allows for various parallels to be made between Cretan religious practices and Egyptian ones. The scarab, a common Egyptian dung beetle, would fashion balls of dung which it lays its egg inside. Eventually, the eggs hatch and the young make their way through the dung and emerge into the world. A process which came to be connected to the notion of reincarnation or rebirth from the soil, but also notions of growth and development. As the scarab is introduced into the Cretan material and religious world, we might imagine that these artifacts served a similar purpose and symbolic meaning in the religious mind of the Cretans. The scarab also acted as the divine manifestation of the Egyptian deity Khepri, who commonly was depicted with a human body and a scarab head. He was the god of the morning sun, who, like the beetle rolls dung, rolls the sun above the horizon, introducing a new day. Although our understanding of early Cretan religion is limited, the religious connection between the rising sun and the afterlife is undeniable. Looking at the Tholos tombs around the Misera Valley and the Estrusian Mountains, all of them, Odigitra, Koumasa, Yeracampos, Tripiti, Abusukari, and many more, have their entrance facing east, directly towards the rising sun. Looking out from the tomb entrance in the morning, we can see the sun rise vertically above the horizon. In the mind of the Minoans, this might have symbolized the reincarnation of the deceased, or how the dead would rise with the sun to another plane of existence. It is certainly hard to know, but fun to hypothesize. It should also be noted that the image is taken from a later form of Tholos tomb, referred to as a Mycenaean Tholos tomb, which could in an abridged fashion be described as a submerged Tholos tomb, a form of burial which would become popular later during the late Minoan period on Crete and the Mycenaean culture on mainland Greece. Unlike the Minoan Tholos tomb, the Mycenaean Tholos tomb has a distinct walled pathed slope, or a so-called dromos, leading to the entrance, while the entrance to a Minoan Tholos tomb commonly is either completely open or connected to an adjoining building. Since the corbelled roof and walls of the early Minoan Tholos tomb around southern Crete no longer remains, you really only get to feel the true contrast between the dark, damp tomb and the bright light from the rising sun when standing inside a Mycenaean Tholos tomb. We will further discuss the Mycenaean Tholos tomb as we enter into the late Minoan period, its function and comparison to early Minoan Tholos tombs, as well as its highly debated origin. At the same time as we start to see the increase in Egyptian wares around the beginning of the early Minoan II period, there is also a noticeable increase in Cycladic wares around southern and central Crete. Previously, it had been chiefly smaller settlements around the Cretan north coast which had seen well-established trade connections with the cultures within the wider Aegean, such as the Cyclades, mainland Greece, and Asia Minor. It is generally believed that it is during this period that we start to see the adaptation of masted sails, which allowed for vessels to travel longer distances, carry more cargo, and employ less manpower to function. With increased trade and interaction with the Eastern Mediterranean came not only new wares and technologies, but also domestic imitation and variation of these wares. Ceramic, marble, and bone figurines had been a common production on Crete since the Neolithic, but it is at the start of the early Minoan II period that some of these figurines, created on Crete and found in tombs around Crete, started to take on Cycladic features. Cycladic figurines were a type of marble figurine or idol which were produced during the early Bronze Age and Neolithic on the Cycladic islands. These figurines show some regional variation around the Cyclades, as well as different stylistic forms depending on time period and specific area. There are, for example, similar idols found around Anatolia during the same period in both terracotta and marble. However, the lifelike appearance, the blank face and enigmatic features of the Cycladic figurines did not only impress the Minoans, but also came to inspire some modern painters such as Pablo Picasso and the sculptor Henry Moore. Most figurines were found deposited in graves around the Cyclades, although some were found in domestic settings indicating that the figurines may have been personal artifacts which followed the deceased in life and were placed inside a tomb as a form of grave goods. The imported Cycladic figurines found around South and Central Crete often display impressive three-dimensional craftsmanship with noticeable attention to details. This figurine found at Koumasa is an example of imported figurines, with the violin-shaped head, the crossed arms with the left arm above the right arm are typical features of the Spedos variety of Cycladic figurines, named after the Cycladic cemetery of the same name on Naxos. From the protruding belly and breast, we can quickly interpret the figurine as a pregnant woman. It should also be noted that the figurines would have been brightly painted, with various colors which would have given them more of a human look. But as time passes, the paint has fallen off, And just like with the once painted classical sculptures of antiquity, all that remains is the blank marble. The Cretan imitations of Cycladic figurines are noticeably less complex. They lack the refined craftsmanship of the figurines produced by contemporary Cycladic artisans. The so-called Koumasa variety of figurines were Cretan imitations of the Cycladic figurines. They were produced around the Messara Valley and found by the Tholos tombs at Koumasa. They were commonly two-dimensional figurines, basically flat and therefore somewhat more brittle, which is why there are multiple examples of broken figurines stitched together through various means. The Tholos tomb is the defining burial style of southern Crete and never seemed to have become popularized to the same extent anywhere else on Crete, although there are a few examples worth mentioning. At Agia Photia, literally translates to holy fire, in northeastern Crete, two structures dating to the Middle Minoan period have been excavated which resemble the circular Tholos tomb from the Messara, both having an entrance facing east towards the rising sun. While these structures certainly all have the prerequisites for being Tholos tombs, they seem to have been built during the Middle Minoan period, contemporary with the construction of the first palaces, around 1300 years after the construction of the first Tholos tombs around the Messara Valley. This had made some scholars doubtful whether these circular tombs could have truly been Tholos tombs, because the construction of the Tholos tomb wasn't generally a pre-palatial phenomenon. This skepticism is further bolstered by the lack of grave goods, ceramics, and human remains from within the tombs. That being said, there are examples of Tholos tombs being constructed during the Middle Minoan. The Tholos tomb at Camillare, for example, constructed during the Middle Minoan 1b period, which we have discussed earlier, indicating a possible resurgence of the Tholos tomb during this period. We also know that Tholos tombs were in use up until the end of the late Minoan period in some instances, so it is quite possible that the Tholos tomb were in use as far east as Agia Photia, although it seems doubtful. Instead of Tholos tombs, Agia Photia would be known for a different type of burial. Towards the end of the early Minoan 1 period, so around 2700 BC, before the construction of the rectangular settlement and the Tholos tombs at Agia Photia, a large cemetery was constructed just east of the later settlement. This necropolis, with at least 252 tombs, is the largest burial complex on Crete from the early Minoan period. The tombs were chamber tombs, constructed utilizing the porous and soft limestone found along the coast. First, a small hole would be dug into the limestone at a depth of up to a meter. Then the burial chamber could be dug out from the side, creating a form of cavity, which the body and various grave goods could be deposited in. The number of individuals buried in each tomb varied from a single individual all the way up to 13 individuals. Once the body had been placed inside the chamber, the tomb was sealed with an upright stone slab, and the large adjacent hole was filled in with both dirt and rocks. Most tombs were shut indefinitely after the burial, without ever being opened again. Other tombs seem to have been opened on one or two more occasions to receive the body of another deceased resident, probably a close relative to the already buried deceased person. Unlike the Tholos tombs around central Crete, these chambers were not communal. They also lacked any form of courtyard or altar for later ceremonies. The bones of the dead remained within the tomb instead of being collected and cleaned before being placed in a nearby ossuary. There are also no evidence of feasting or ritual consumption of animals or the pouring of libations in connection with funerals at Agia Photia. Nor is there any indication of individuals returning to the graves to engage in the same fashion of ancestral worship which defined the Tholos tomb. The entrance of these chamber tombs faced the ocean, so towards the north, and not towards the rising sun in the east. So the philosophy and logic around the burials at Agia Photia deviated noticeably from other burials around Crete during the early pre-Palatial period, and we might question why. Looking into the goods deposited within the chamber tombs, we might come to understand the root of this discrepancy. This yard found in the chamber tombs, with its vertical incisions, small and narrow neck, displays features common to Cycladic pottery from the early Bronze Age. Items in a Cycladic style and construction are the most common goods found deposited within the graves at Agia Photia, accounting for a total of around 90% of all pottery. Some Cycladic style examples are pyxes with lids, vessels for burning incense, and the remains of imported Cycladic figurines. It is, however, generally agreed that most of the pottery was constructed on Crete at Agia Photia, indicating that the culture at the settlement would have been Cycladic in origin. That being said, there are examples of Cretan pottery imported from other settlements around the island. For example, the existence of Agios Onufrios ware from south-central Crete indicate that the site would have been a part of the greater trade system around Crete. The question then arises whether the inhabitants were Cretans who had appropriated Cycladic practices through trade and interaction, or if these inhabitants were Cycladic settlers making Crete their home. Whatever the case, the settlement at Agia Photia was deserted during the late early Minoan II period, and the graveyard ceased to be in use. The later rectangular settlement at Agia Photia, discussed previously, was built during the Middle Minoan 1A period and lacks any close connections to the Cyclades. The Tholos tombs around central Crete and the chamber tombs at Agia Photia are the first examples of early Bronze Age burials on Crete dating to the early Minoan 1 period. Around the early Minoan 2 period, a couple of hundreds of years after the first Tholos tombs, we see the construction of the most common and most numerous Minoan type of tomb during the pre-Palatial period, the so-called house tomb. While the notion of a house tomb might give the indication of some sort of standardized house, in reality, these tombs could have various shapes and sizes, with some tombs consisting of no more than a singular rectangular room, while other house tombs were large complexes of multiple rooms, although the earliest tombs consisted of just a couple of rooms at most. House tombs can be found widely around Crete, from central Crete to the shores of eastern Crete, with examples found at Psychro, Malia, Archanes, just to name a few. At the northeast coast, separated from the mainland by 150 meters strait, is the small island of Mochlos. Its perfectly defensible position allowed for settlers to inhabit the island already during the end of the final Neolithic period. The first wave of settlers seemed to have arrived from the Cyclades and brought with them large quantities of obsidian from Melos, which were worked into blades and later distributed throughout Crete. As time went on, Cretans from the mainland joined the settlement, and by the early Minoan II period, the population around the island might have reached as much as 500 individuals. With its geographical position connecting Crete to the wider Aegean, the island became closely defined by both Cretan, Cycladic, and some Eastern influences. Both industry and trade seem to have become the cornerstone of the everyday at Mochlos. Precious metals and materials such as gold, silver, copper, ivory, obsidian, and marble would make its way to the settlement before later ending up at different locations around Crete. The artisans at Mochlos would see quite a large variety of foreign goods pass by the settlement, allowing for a great degree of inspiration and also imitation in the production of wares. So throughout the early Minoan, Mochlos would perfect various metal and stoneworking techniques from both the Cyclades and the Near East. So the construction of the first house tombs at Mochlos started during the early Minoan II period, around the western part of the island. Some were a single rectangular building, but one tomb complex consisting of 3 rooms, room 4, 5 and 6, placed dramatically by the cliff edge, has stolen the spotlight. A small path runs along the western part of the island from the settlement to the cemetery. The winding road moves around the side of the island, passing by numerous smaller house tombs before arriving at the larger complex. Each tomb is well integrated into the landscape and the rocky sides of the island, and due to the geography of the island along with the winding pathway, the tombs could not be seen from the settlement. The items found within the tombs display some incredible craftsmanship for the period, especially the items made of gold, such as these golden diadems, bracelets and rings. The golden diadems in particular have to some degree become a defining item of the house tombs at Mochlos. Various golden ornaments would also have been attached to the diadem, creating an impressive funerary crown or potentially funerary death mask, which would only have been fit for the truly powerful individuals on the island. Another area which defines the production at Mochlos was that of stone wares, a form of stone carving technique utilizing drills for hollowing out the vessel and coarse stone and sand for grinding and polishing the surface. The artisans used both local and imported stones for producing these stone vessels, such as soft stones, chlorite, serpentine, and steatite, sometimes called soapstone, but also alabaster and marble. The production of stone vessels seemed to have started in Egypt and had been perfected around the Cyclades, eventually influencing local artisans around Crete. The jugs, pixies, and other vessels made of stone which were found within the house tombs at Mochlos exemplifies the high level of skill exhibited by local stone carvers during this period. Many of these stone wares were then used in a funerary setting by the tombs, and from the finds, the function of these wares were connected to the pouring of libation, consumption of liquid for drinking like wine, milk and honey, along with vessels for the burning of incense. The decision to also deposit these stone vessels as grave offerings continue a common tradition from Egypt, where stone vessels were left within the tomb of the deceased, indicating a strong presence of Eastern influence on the island. The house tombs at Mochlos had a multitude of similarities to the Tholos tombs at the Messera. Outside the house tomb complex consisting of room 4, 5 and 6, there was a courtyard, and towards the southeast part of the courtyard, a small platform may have served as an altar, features which also were common around the tombs at central Crete. The burial procedures at these tombs also share many similarities with the tombs around the Messera. The body was moved into the tomb and laid on the floor at room 4. Once placed in the room, personal belongings, various gifts and offerings were placed around the body. And then once the ceremony was done, the mourners would close the tomb, allowing for the body to decompose, undisturbed within the chamber. The offerings of foods and drinks placed with the body may have served as sustenance for the deceased as the dead made the journey to the afterlife, imitating some Eastern traditions. Once the body had decomposed, the tomb was once again reopened, with the remains of the bones being deposited in the adjacent room, room 6, which basically functioned as a form of ossuary. With time, the bones started to pile up, and it seemed necessary to construct a second rectangular room, room 5, which was constructed to add a second ossuary to the complex to accommodate bones from new burials. Considering the wealth of materials found around the house tombs at Mochlos, we could imagine that the funerary goods and general opulence were a means of signifying wealth and power. The most impressive and elaborate wares could generally be found around 2 house tomb complexes, tombs 1 to 3 and tombs 4 to 6. The many small house tombs along the pathway may thus have served as tombs for average inhabitants, while the larger complexes served as house tombs for the families of the ruling elite or the families of wealthy traders. Going back to the map of Crete and the different types of burials from the pre-Palatial period, we have discussed the Tholos tomb from south-central Crete, shaft or chamber tombs around Agia Photia, and house tombs at Mochlos. But we have yet to discuss the burial practices most common to Western Crete. The most notable form of burial from Western Crete are cave burials. Caves which had been used as settlements since before the start of the Neolithic, and acquiring a slow but noticeable transition from places of residence to places of worship and burial during the early Minoan period. Quite a few of these burial caves have been found around Western Crete, with some notable finds which indicate somewhat of a divergence in terms of material culture from the remainder of Crete. One of the most notable early Minoan caves is that of Plativola Cave, located in Western Crete about 10 kilometers southeast of the modern town of Chania. The burial deposits give a great insight into the type of goods which were produced and of course imported into the area, especially considering the rich number of wares found at the site. A common local pottery style around Western Crete during this period are wares with a brushed finish, which gives the pottery a coarse exterior with parallel lines as if a brush had been dragged across the exterior before firing. These brushed wares were a common form of locally produced pottery, yet the most common locally produced style seems to have been imitations of other foreign goods. The large degree of foreign influence around Western Crete indicated an area which was culturally closely connected to both mainland Greece and to the Cyclades. Helladic-style monocolored pouring vessels, so-called sauceboats from mainland Greece, along with incised wares mimicking Cycladic pottery, such as this pyxie, were all common forms of locally produced pottery. Although influence from Central and Eastern Crete is not wholly absent around Western Crete, there are a few examples of the Koumasa variety of folded arms figurines, the same figurines produced around Mesera and deposited in Tholos tombs around central Crete, but now found around the caves of Western Crete. But in general, the ceramic style around Western Crete is far more closely connected to the Helladic cultures around mainland Greece. And if we consider the geographical location of Western Crete, it is not all that surprising that the area seems culturally connected to the Helladic cultures of mainland Greece. Just from a radius of 70 kilometers from the early Minoan settlement at Castelli Hill, modern-day Chania, we can reach the island of Eileithyia. At 110 kilometers, the island of Kythera itself, and at 120 kilometers, the Peloponnese on mainland Greece. The islands of Kythera and Eileithyia were cultural springboards, a direct path for trade and cultural exchange, which seemed to help bring Western Crete and mainland Greece culturally closer to one another, which is probably why Western Crete during the early Minoan period certainly deviates from the remainder of Crete. That being said, cave burials were common around other areas of Crete, especially mountainous areas such as the beautiful plateau at the Lasiti Mountains. At least two caves, the Psychro and Trapeza cave, have signs of burials dating to the early Minoan I period. Both caves are located at a bit of an altitude above the nearby plain, and it is quite probable that a procession of mourners would make their way up along the mountainside before entering the cave itself. Coming from the bright sun, entering the dark, damp cave would have been like entering a different world. While initially pitch black, you could only hear the dripping from the stalactites, but once the eyes had adapted to the darkness, you would be able to discern some of the fascinating features of these caves. In north-central Crete, not far away from Knossos, there are a few examples of burial caves from the early Minoan I period. The Eileithyia cave, named after the Greek goddess of childbearing, Eileithyia, had been in use since the Neolithic period and would continue to be in use up until the Roman period. The cave would be closely connected to Greek mythology and even mentioned in Homer's epics. According to tradition dating back to the Archaic period, Hera had given birth to Eileithyia at the cave, making Zeus her father and Hera her mother, which gives the location a mythological origin and motivated the cult function of the cave. Now, it is quite probable that the cave was dedicated to a similar childbearing goddess of Minoan origin during the early Minoan period, which might have been the precursor to the later goddess Eileithyia. The Eileithyian cave is not like those of the Leciti mountain. It is no more than 60 meters in depth and far more accessible. At the back of the cave is a small altar with a stalagmite, which functioned as a form of Bethel, a worshipping stone embodying the deity, often said to also resemble a female figure. The cave is known to have had different ceremonial functions, especially for pregnant women who are said to have rubbed their belly against the Bethel as a form of ritual for good luck. The Bethel was an aniconic representation of the deity, aniconic meaning without likeness or without image, and describes an item or object which represents a deity or sacred individual but does not resemble the individual or the deity. Around the Levant, these Bethel stones were called the home of the god, which is also the Semitic meaning of the word, as Bethel would have translated to house of the god, which the Greeks later incorporated into their own vocabulary. In this case, the stalagmite pillar is an aniconic representation of a form of a goddess. The Minoans on Crete and the Helladic cultures on mainland Greece will worship both aniconic stones, pillars, and trees as representation of different deities, a tradition which will continue even after the Bronze Age. Think of the Omphalos navel stone at Delphi, which represented a connection between the gods and mortals. Most votive figurines deposited inside the cave play on concepts of fertility, and we might imagine that the cave's connection with a fertility or motherly goddess goes back to even before the Bronze Age. A similar cave just to the east is the Pyrgos cave, which also was used for burials during the early Minoan I period. The numerous wares and a specific ceramic style found within the cave was coined as Pyrgos ware, after the burial cave itself. The style was defined by dark burnished pottery, either in black, grey or brown, with horizontal, incised lines running around the pottery, along with some vertical and diagonal lines. Some have hypothesized that, for example, these chalices were created with the intention of mimicking wooden chalices, which might also explain the pattern. The Pyrgos wares were appreciated around northern Crete, where they seem to have been produced around various workshops, and even some exported south to the Messera plain. The style remained popular throughout the early Minoan I period, but started to cease towards the early Minoan II period, and never really made it to the settlements around eastern Crete.